Is it your moral duty to vote? Is it a gross act of privilege not to vote? Is voting for the lesser of two evils still voting for evil? With the presidential election looming here in the U.S., a race between a convicted felon,
I did everything right and they indicted me,
and a guy who doesn't know what year it is,
I'll beat Donald Trump. I will beat him again in 2020.
These questions are being asked more than usual. Now, for a lot of liberals, voting isn't just a good deed. It's a moral imperative to save democracy.
Make sure you're registered to vote.
Absolutely.
Make sure all of your friends vote. And if you don't like Biden, that's fine, but you have to go vote for democracy.
For others, voting for Biden feels like a tacit endorsement of his policies, including ongoing military support for Israel or crackdowns on immigration. Now, YouTube's #1 ex-philosopher recently tapped in on the discourse, questioning anti-electoral leftists and even accusing them of political LARPing. And for those of you asking, I'm currently YouTube's number 17 ex-philosopher. So top 20, it's not bad. Okay, so today we're gonna try to figure this out. We're gonna start with the history of voting in America and examine why it's treated as such a cherished duty. We're then gonna consider the ethics of voting from a philosophical perspective and ask if it's morally possible to be politically engaged without voting. And by the end of this video, you should have your mind 100% made up about voting. But spoiler alert, probably not. It's a confusing topic and there's still gonna be a lot to think about, but hopefully we can do some of that together. As we get closer to the election, it can be really difficult to make sure that you're staying informed with what's really going on. So many media organizations are prioritizing clicks over clear and accurate information, or reducing complex voting issues to simple sound bites. But this is why I've been using Ground News. Ground News is a website and app created by a former NASA engineer to empower readers to navigate our complex media landscape. They aggregate articles from over 50,000 news sources around the world and across the political spectrum and allow you to compare headlines, see the reliability of the source, and where the bias leans per article. Let me show you how it works. Take a look at this story on Biden's candidacy. You can see here it's been covered by more than 45 sources. And over here, we can see where the source's bias leans on the bias distribution chart and see who owns each source on the ownership chart. You can also check out the factuality rating, which is an assessment of the reporting practices of a news publication based on the average score of 3 different rating systems. Now, all of these factors can influence framing, and you can compare how the biases of different news organizations affect their coverage of a given topic. For example, a left-leaning publication headlined the story with House Democrats meet as Biden's support on Capitol Hill hangs in the balance. A right-leaning publication headlines the same story as felt like a funeral. Democratic lawmakers in disarray and critical House caucus meeting about Biden's future. And you can really see how the language used can change your perception of the story. Now, one of my favorite features in Ground News is the blind spot feature, which shows you stories that are disproportionately reported by either side of the political spectrum. This is great because it allows you to escape your own personal echo chamber and read stories you might not come across otherwise. I really appreciate how Ground News helps me step outside, reading articles and links from the same sources and people I might like a lot and share my beliefs by giving me a much broader sense of what's going on in the political discourse, what's being covered, and how it's being covered. Now, if you're interested in checking it out, go over to ground.news/wisecrack and you're gonna get 40% off the Vantage plan, which gives you unlimited access to all features. So please go check them out. And we're gonna get back to figuring out the ethics of this whole voting thing. The framers of the Constitution saw voting not as a natural right, but a privilege conferred by government, according to historian Alan J. Lichtman, making the history of voting in America a history of who isn't allowed to vote in America. That inequality, which continues to permeate the system, complicates the argument that we have a moral imperative to vote. The various ways of restricting the right to vote make it seem like the average American was honestly never really intended to have a whole lot of say in things. According to Lichtman, American leaders opposed grassroots popular engagement with government, believing they should make their voices heard at the ballot box and then join the rest of us in sitting down and shutting up. Voting laws operate at the state level, and this right was first offered exclusively to white property-owning men. Let me know in the comments if you're all 3 of those things. I only got 2 right now. Probably forever. I mean, look at housing prices in Southern California. I'm probably never voting in the olden days. Now, as John Adams put it, very few men who have no property have any judgment of their own. And basically, since voting has been a thing, fears of voter fraud have been used to further restrict voting rights. It was first thought that wealthy people would buy the votes of corruptible people, namely women and black folks. Unlike today, early voter fraud wasn't fabricated paranoia. It was actually pretty common for gigantic party machines to bribe voters, especially once states started dispensing with property laws for white men. By the second half of the 19th century, America saw its highest voter turnout ever, as much as 81% of eligible folks. The working class was talking politics in saloons and streetcars, and outnumbering wealthy people in the polls. Political culture was defined by fiery debates, huge torchlighting parades and rallies, and gaudy displays like burning effigies or roasting hogs. And the Civil War became a huge historical fault line. But even as the post-war, military-occupied Reconstruction-era South was required to let black men vote, few northern states followed suit. Rather than creating a universal right to vote, by 1870, Congress simply passed an amendment to protect black men from discriminatory voting policies. And the results here were staggering. 80% of formerly enslaved eligible black men registered to vote. Despite racial violence that killed 1,000 black people in Louisiana just that year, black men swung the 1878 election results to Ulysses S. Grant. But political violence remained rampant and made voting more dangerous for some Americans, further complicating the idea of a moral imperative. Now, anxiety about voting, giving the normies too much say, led cities to pass laws limiting democratic action. Things like increasing the tenures of elected officials and making more positions appointed, while some proposed making presidential terms 8 years to reduce political conflict. The clampdown on suffrage, justified by fears of voter fraud, explicitly targeted black voters in the South and immigrant voting power in the North. New policies ranged from creating registration requirements to purging voter rolls annually to rescheduling local elections not to correspond to national ones. Now, other common tactics for disqualifying voters were literacy tests, poll taxes, and laws limiting certain ex-felons from voting. And voting officials had the discretion to enforce these policies solely against people of color and immigrants. In 2014, a Harvard professor gave his class the Louisiana literacy test, used for black voters up until 1964, and not a single Harvard student passed, which either proves that the test was unfair or that Ivy League kids are wildly overrated. Meanwhile, in the North, reporter Aaron Geiger-Smith writes, each time a new immigrant group became prominent, changes to citizenship laws were debated and often enacted. And voters were deemed ineligible in increasingly baffling ways. An Arizona court decision in 1928 ruled the Native Americans couldn't vote because they were wards of the state, meaning the state was effectively their guardian, and like children, they too couldn't vote. And these tactics worked. While 81% of eligible voters turned out in 1880, just 49% did by 1920. And these policies were, unsurprisingly, most devastating for black people. In the South, presidential turnout amongst eligible black voters went from 61% in 1880 to just 2% in 1912. I said 61%, and then I said 2%. As late as 1940, only 3% of Southern black people were registered to vote. 1940, it's possible that someone born in 1940 could be watching this video. If so, hi. These policies turned voting from being centered on participation from a broad working class to one used primarily by elites for their benefit. Efforts to increase voting accessibility over the course of the 20th century led to significant gains. Though even some of this was still pretty cynical, as white suffragettes won over legislators by arguing that giving women the vote would outweigh black male voters' influence. The passage of the Voting Rights Act did lead to a spike in black voter registration, but this is at a time when voting for black people remained incredibly risky. But in the decades since, states have continued to move in the opposite direction, from fine-tuning gerrymandering tactics to make black votes count less to implementing strict voter ID laws. Restrictions on voting intensified after a 2013 Supreme Court decision walked back much of the Voting Rights Act, and 2023 saw near record levels of new restrictive voting laws. Now, much of it is done under the guise of stopping voter fraud. This all complicates narratives around the moral good of voting, as the very nation we're supposedly serving by voting has actively worked to decrease both the power of voting and our access to voting. It feels a bit ironic that a society which tells us to vote or die,
Vote or die, motherfucker, vote or die,
also makes it harder and harder for some individuals to vote. But does this change the debates about our responsibility to vote? Does a messy system make the act of voting any more or any less ethical? Is there a moral argument to be made here, or is this just a weird civic version of religious guilt? Well, philosopher Jason Brennan tries to answer some of these questions in his 2011 book, The Ethics of Voting. And, I'll note here that the book was written at a time when American politics felt a little more normal, but I think the arguments are still relevant. Now, he argues that voting in itself is not, in fact, an ethical necessity, and that in some cases, it can be actively harmful. Now, I don't have time to get into the full scope of his book here, but he spends much of it responding to prominent arguments for why we should vote. And if you want to read them all, you should go to the library. Get his book. Reading is great. Not enough people read. Maybe more people should read. Maybe you should be the change that I want to see in the world, and go read a book. Let me know if you do. One of the positions he considers, the civic virtue argument, holds that voting is an essential way to exercise civic virtue, and civic virtue is an important moral virtue. While Brennan argues that civic virtue is a moral virtue, he writes that citizens can have exceptional civic virtue despite disengagement with politics. Most ways to exercise civic virtue in contemporary liberal democracies do not involve politics. And there is a case to be made that voting is given too much credit as an act of civic virtue, making it possible to do something that takes a few minutes once every 2 or 4 years and feel like we're being exceptionally moral. On the other hand, we can imagine someone who is contributing positively to the fabric of their community on a daily basis and who doesn't vote and might be considered less moral because of this. Now, Brennan offers the example of artists, entrepreneurs, small business owners, venture capitalists, teachers, physicians, intellectuals, stock traders, stay-at-home parents, working parents, chefs, janitors, and grocery clerks as folks who are actively contributing to fostering a worthwhile society. I agree with him for the most part, but at least 3 of those made me roll my eyes. If you can guess those 3 right in the comments, consider us friends for life. Now, this can help us reframe the current debates around voting, as if we agree that the ideal end of voting is creating a more engaged and just society, then we should probably acknowledge that voting is just one of many ways to do that, particularly in a system that purposely makes it difficult for certain demographics to vote by doing things like requiring photo ID or not having a national holiday for presidential elections. If you guys know that, American friends, in a lot of other countries, it's on voting day, you don't have to work. It's like a holiday. You go out, you vote, you have some drinks, maybe make eyes with someone across the bar, and they have an I voted sticker, you have an I voted sticker, but their hat's for the other candidate, and first you think you hate them, but that hatred has an electric effect on you. And then you kind of jokingly say, like, should we check out the bathroom? And they say, oh, maybe we should. And you both, think you're joking, and the next thing you know, you're doing it in the bathroom on election day. That's what we could have in America, because that's what all Europeans do on election days. But we just rush back to work. Okay, but let's say that the current political stakes, at least in America, require that we all vote, whether or not we're personally into the candidates on offer. Even in this scenario, Brennan argues that voting is only truly ethical if you vote well. Now, this means that voting for a candidate because they have a good vibe, or because they're a member of your preferred party, or even because, they have convincing rhetoric in their speeches, is not a morally justifiable reason for doing so. Brennan writes that I argue that citizens have an obligation not to vote badly. They should abstain rather than pollute democracy with bad votes. So the only way to ethically vote is with a full knowledge and understanding of the candidate and the policies you're supporting and the effect these policies will have on society. Now, for example, voting for Trump because he tells it like it is and wants America to be strong again without understanding his policies is fundamentally unethical, according to Brennan. Don't get mad at me in the comments. As would be voting for Biden because, well, you always vote Democrat, or he's the only one who can defeat Trump. Again, we're not telling you to vote for. We don't do politics. No one on our staff has ever voted. We only hire people who have never voted because we do objective, apolitical analysis. Some of you actually want that. That's so weird. Brennan thinks this type of voting sucks, and he writes that unexcused, harmful voting occurs when a person votes without epistemic justification for harmful policies or for candidates likely to enact harmful policies. For example, a person who votes to ban gay marriage because she finds it disgusting would be guilty of harmful voting. What he's saying here is that the dominant trend of emotionally fueled culture war voting is actively harmful.
I ended woke, totally. And then in their first week, they reestablished it. It's crazy.
And that many of the arguments made for it are not epistemically justified, which means not grounded in a logical or reasonable analysis of political reality. But of course, this can get complicated, because we could ask, well, just how much knowledge and understanding do we need to have to vote in an ethical manner? Should we all have to have our political science degrees handy when we head to the polls? And Brennan is relatively blunt here, writing, "To be clear, my position is that people should vote only if they have good epistemic credentials. It might turn out that few people have good credentials about politics, but it might not." This might ring a little too close to some of the old literacy tests, especially used to exclude black voters. Education could be seen as an invisible barrier to keep certain groups of folks away from wielding political influence. Brennan acknowledges that there is a world in which it's true that levels of education correlate along class and race lines that are not great. But he writes that this doesn't invalidate his argument. Rather, it simply points out the gross injustice in our society, noting that if we want informed voters and a strong democracy, then educational justice is necessary. Indeed, we need only to look back to the mid-19th century to see that the association of political engagement with wealth is not a given, but the result of a number of societal factors. And this, of course, is to say nothing of the fact that many people's primary exposure to political information is the news, which, as we've talked about before in a bunch of videos, is much more motivated by spectacle and profit than by civic education. And this seems to create just another barrier between regular voters and actually understanding what's going on. Because you can't trust the media, but you can trust people that make videos on YouTube. It feels silly to say that, but honestly, I think it's kind of true these days. Let me know in the comments your favorite YouTube channels that, help you understand what's going on in the world. Okay, so when we do vote, according to Brennan, we need to do so in accordance with the public-spirited view, which holds that citizens ought to vote for the common good. On this view, citizens ought not aim for purely private interests, especially when such interests come at the expense of the common good. Voters should look for policies good for all, rather than seeking to exploit their fellow citizens through government. So, for example, if a policy would cut your taxes while bankrupting schools, then hey, maybe just take the hit so we can afford to pay teachers, But even if we agree that voting for the common good is a moral option, we still could be tempted to ask, okay, but what if the best thing for the common good isn't voting at all? Now this might sound dumb, and hey, maybe it is, but various philosophers, theorists, and activists have argued that voting is everything from a useless exercise to a mechanism of validating a fundamentally unjust system. Now, back in 2007, when asked why bother to vote, philosopher Slavoj Žižek began his response, "With a few exceptions, it is not worth bothering to vote. We ordinary voters do not decide about things that really matter." For example, voters have functionally no say over the Supreme Court, whose 9 unelected officials are making the most consequential decisions in American political life. If his take stopped there, it might seem like nothing more than, lefty academic cynicism. But he goes on to argue that today, the majority of those who do not vote are not refusing out of protest, just relying on others to do it. Their no is just a sign of indifference. What we need is an active no, supported by civil society movements and pressure groups. In other words, he's saying, if you don't vote because you don't like your political options and then don't do anything to, say, influence policies in your community, that's not an active no. This active versus passive approach is similar to the distinction between a passive and active nihilism, something we've talked about before. But to refresh our collective memories, passive nihilism is when we respond to the inherent meaninglessness of reality with cynical resignation, while active nihilism is when we respond by attempting to construct new forms of meaning and value. This all leads Žižek to argue for politics motivated by a Herman Melville character. Sadly, it's not a Moby Dick-based political theory, but let me know in the comments what you think Moby Dick politics would be. Now, Žižek writes that we should reinvent Bartleby politics, after the famous clerk from Herman Melville's short story who answers all his boss's orders. I would prefer not to. The threat today is not passivity, but pseudo-activity. The urge to be active, to participate, to mask the nothingness of what goes on. The truly difficult thing is to step back, to withdraw from it. Those in power often prefer even a critical participation, a dialogue to silence. Anything to break our ominous passivity. Only such a withdrawal will create a space for really doing something. He's pointing out all the ways in which our society creates forms of pseudo-activity. These are things that make us feel like we're doing something and making a difference while we're posing no real threat to the system. Now, whether this be social media posts expressing solidarity, donating to charities that spend most of their money on overhead, or even participating in certain protests and actions. Zizek's saying that in the face of these options, it might actually be preferable to just do nothing. And it could be argued that voting fits right into this paradigm, especially when the best case scenario is a politician who, better represents the interest of oil lobbyists than your family. Unless your family are oil lobbyists. In that case, it's a real win-win for you. Also, sign up for our Patreon because you have oil money, and we could use some of your oil money. Now, Zizek expands the idea of Bartleby politics in what I think is his best book, The Parallax View. Writing about Bartleby, he says that his "I would prefer not to" is to be taken literally. It says, "I would prefer not to," not "I don't prefer or care to." In his refusal of the master's order, Bartleby does not negate the predicate. Rather, he affirms a non-predicate. He does not say that he doesn't want to do it. He says that he wants not to do it. Okay, so the gist here, when applied to voting, is that to not vote in a politically useful way would imply wanting to not vote in an active sense rather than simply not voting in a passive way. This is the difference between not doing the dishes because you forgot or don't feel like it, or not doing the dishes because you want your partner to know that you're mad at them. Don't do that, by the way. I get the impulse sometimes to not do something around the house as a way to show that you're upset. It's never going to work out for you. Never. I wish it would. It'd be so much fun if it would, but it won't, so don't do it. Now, while it probably doesn't feel like not doing stuff is the pathway to revolution, Zizek writes that this is how we pass from the politics of resistance or protestation to a politics which opens up a new space outside the hegemonic position and its negation. This means that when the dominant order tells us to vote and make your voice heard, we can respond with yeah dog, I would prefer not to. And in doing so, Zizek calls for us to avoid types of resistance which help the system to reproduce itself by ensuring our participation in it. And it's not a coincidence that after the 2016 election, the language of resistance was co-opted by mainstream electoral politics. Another way to think of all this is that certain acts of resistance against various systems are still tacit endorsements of the system, which means that voting and other types of liberal activism that work in concert with our system could be seen as keeping the very system afloat. However, at the same time, we might worry that if we all just stop voting in one collective act of "I would prefer not to," then a smaller subset of folks would say, hey, that's fine with us, and then have an even stronger dominance over our political system. In this way, removing ourselves from the machinations of the state might only make the machine more powerful. Okay, so we can end by returning to the questions posed by ContraPoint's Natalie Wynn in her recent tweets about the anti-electoralist left, meaning that folks who are on the left that argue against participating in electoral politics as a viable strategy. Now, she brings up Democrats' climate bill, infrastructure investment, and nomination of Justice Jackson as things accomplished, or at least in part accomplished, via voting. And she then asks what those advocating for anti-electoralism have accomplished in the same time. Now, we've seen Brennan argue for a passive anti-electoralism vis-a-vis the point that folks who aren't adequately informed are better off not voting, along with arguing that there are non-electoral ways to exhibit all types of civic virtue. But this differs from those who are seemingly informed and then advocating for not voting as a political strategy. Considering Brennan's position, it seems like these folks would only be ethically justified if they made major contributions to civic society outside of voting. This is seemingly the thing that Wynn is asking to see the receipts for. But to consider this in light of Zizek's Bartleby-inspired politics, it seems like it could maybe be argued that Wynn's position, namely even if you're left-wing, it's important to strategically vote against Donald Trump, is still one which could functionally be upholding the system, and one which allows some to brand themselves as being part of the resistance. Now, it's easy and maybe even fair to argue that sure, but now isn't the time to screw around. This election is different and we can go ahead and change the system later. But it does seem like increasingly every election is becoming the most important one ever, and that we're constantly being told that if we don't vote for folks we might not be very excited about, the collapse of our nation and even our world will be our fault. But as we know, voter mobilization can be empowering when it means knowledgeably and strategically voting in our own interest. I mean, we saw this recently in France when the surprising cooperation of leftist and centrist party leaders motivated an increased voter turnout and led to both awesome videos of cool-looking French people getting really excited and other videos of French dudes that look like Kyle Rittenhouse being very unexcited. And this has led to a leftist plurality in parliament and prevented a far-right government from taking hold for the first time since literally the Nazis. While it'd be more fun and better fodder for reactions if I were to tell you conclusively why voting is absolutely moral or absolutely immoral, it feels a little bit reckless here to force an either-or in this particular instance. But hey, at least we have lots of time to think about this between now and November. And for all of my non-American friends, I really hope that you're enjoying the entertainment that we're creating via another dysfunctional American election cycle. Your cynical enjoyment of our country makes it all worth it. But do let us know what you think in the comments. I know this is a big question, and I want to know what we think about this one. Seriously, so let us know down there. A huge shout out to all of our patrons. If you feel like joining this group, even if you don't have oil money, there's a link in the description. You get all of our videos early with no ads. You get extra audio and video content. We even have a $1 level if you just want to sort of throw a dollar in the tip jar, and we'll throw you some freebies occasionally. It's a great way to support us. But you support us just by being here. So thank you for being here, and ring the bell and click stuff and share the channel with your friends. Maybe send this one to one of your parents to see if it makes them mad. And I guess in the meantime, I'll see you at the polls. Or not.